It was a few years ago when a strange thing happened. My family, just my parents and my brother and me, we had dinner together, and there were, for some reason, no spouses around, no grandchildren, no nephews, just the four of us sitting at the table having dinner. And then as the dinner was over, I had this brilliant idea that my laptop was there, and I thought, why don't we each take a personality test and learn about better ways that each of us could communicate. So my mother was the first to take the test. And you have to know about my mother that she is one of those people who wants to get along with everyone all the time. She wants to be aligned with all the people around her. She does not like drama. She does not like conflict. She does not like to argue. She doesn't like to talk about difficult subjects. Very easygoing person, very important to her. So this test on communication, personality types and communication came back, and it said that this person, my mother, should probably learn about the value of conflict. To which my mother said, "The value of conflict?" So incredibly foreign was it to her way of thinking. She couldn't even imagine that there was value there. So we found this very funny, all of us, because there was a sense of recognition in this moment. When we went on to my dad. Now my father he was a businessman, very successful, and he was one of those people who always had an opinion on everything. Unlike my mother, he would walk into the fire and talk about controversial topics, and he never shied away from any of that. So the test came back, and it said that this person, my father, might benefit from letting go of the myth that the world would be a better place if everybody thought just like him. To which my father, not skipping a beat, said, "Well, it would." So then my test came back, and it said I needed to work on people-pleasing and actually saying what I really thought and felt. And my brother's came back, and it said he needed to be a little bit more emotionally aware of other people when he was talking to them. But I have to tell you, while this test touched some tender places in each of us, we also found it hilarious. Because for the first time in our family, we were actually discussing the dynamics that had informed our way of being as far back as we could remember. And not just informed our way of being, also our way of being out in the world, our way of understanding ourselves in the world. We were working out those family dynamics out in our jobs and in our relationships and with our friends, and never quite realizing what was happening there at home, how it had all started there. So to hear those dynamics named, to hear that somebody in the family was the fixer, trying to always fix everything, and somebody in the family was the avoider, trying to always avoid anything difficult, and someone in the family was the certain one who always knew exactly how it should be. To us, this dynamic was both hilarious, but also a recognition of something that had been there since the beginning, that we had never, ever named. It had guided our whole lives. So, this morning's sermon is not necessarily going to be about the idea that maybe if we all just sit down at the table and talk it through, we will figure ourselves out better, we'll heal the world that way. There might be some importance in that, but that's actually not what the sermon is about. And in fact, when I was in seminary, one of my mentors was Bill Schultz. Bill Schultz was the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association back in the 1980s, and then he went on to be the chair of Amnesty International. And Bill told us that every minister, especially early in their career, has a sermon that they regret. And I was thinking about that this week when I was thinking about this communication one. He told us too, he said his sermon that he regretted, he was a young minister back in the early 1970s, and he says he still winces when he thinks about this sermon that he delivered to a New England, stuffy New England church. It was entitled, "In Praise of Pornography." Yeah. He said he still hasn't lived that one down. My sermon that I regret is much less provocative than that. It was a sermon on communication delivered about 10 years ago when we were all talking about this idea that if we just sit down at the table, across the divisions we were experiencing in this country, if we just sat down and really got to know people on the other side, that everything would be okay. And the main text that I used for this sermon was a book that was new at the time, a book that talked about this idea of reaching across division. It was a book entitled Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. I made some poor worship associate read a passage from that. Can you imagine? Anyway, live and learn, right? We evolve, we change, we grow. Our understanding of what good communication changes as well. In seminary, one of the things that was really a startling discovery for me was the idea that when we are engaging with someone, we could simply say, "Tell me more about that." You see, I had lived up to that point with the idea that when people tell you information, you're always trying to decode it and figure it out and interpret it, and if you didn't get it when they said it, there was something wrong with you. But what freedom that meant when you could actually say to somebody, "Tell me more about that." To give them space to share, and you space to really take it in and hear it. Healthy communication is something that is real when it comes to words and conversations. There are things we can do to better connect with people. There's a book that influenced me several years ago called Crucial Conversations. And in that book, it talked about the idea of truly entering into a conversation with curiosity allows things to happen that don't happen when we've already made up our minds going into the conversation. And that's a tough thing to do, because most of us are looking toward the conclusion rather than thinking about being in the moment. It's something we're all guilty of, me included. But healthy communication invites us into that space of being uncertain. And part of being a Unitarian Universalist is being uncertain. I don't know if you've noticed, but we really don't have answers for a lot of things, right? A lot of questions, but not so many answers. So uncertainty in our faith tradition actually positions us to be a little more open to what might actually come through when we make space for people to share. Other things that we can do in terms of communication is to speak straight from what we feel. My experience has been this. I'm feeling this way. Whether it's in our personal relationships or in our congregation or communities that are relational, like a congregation, it's important that we don't generalize. It doesn't work well when you say to your spouse, "You know, everybody says that you're really difficult." You know? You gotta own it. Same in the church community, right? You gotta own what you're feeling and not use those generalities in those situations. And allowing yourself to be wrong. I may be wrong. One of my colleagues, when he got ordained, he was a man of a certain age when he started on the path to ministry. He had a white beard and a lovely wife, and people just automatically, culturally, gave him a lot of authority as a minister. So what he got tattooed on his arm when he was ordained was, "I could be wrong." Just where he could see it. So when he was up there preaching, he could see that on his arm each week. I could be wrong. It's important that we don't position ourselves when we're trying to communicate as infallible. We make mistakes, all of us. There are times when we are wrong and times when we need to open ourselves up even more. But I think communication and healthy communication, and this is where this differs from the sermon I would have given 10 years ago, is more than just words. It's something beyond words. I was thinking about being 11 and 12, and we went on a church work trip each summer to a home for people who were intellectually disabled. And this was a place in Missouri it was like a large university campus with all different kinds of housing for people based on their needs. And the first day that we were there, I'm with this little group of 11 and 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, and they say to us, we're going to take each one of you and put you in a group with a staff member that's going to be taking some of these folks out for their afternoon activities. And I was terrified. I mean, it was one thing to be there en masse with this group of youth my age. It was another thing to be separated out. So I was paired with this college student who was on staff there, who took 6 people out into the park in the afternoons under this great big tree. And the people that were in this group were all people who were dealing with profound disabilities, multiple disabilities. So profound intellectual disability, but also different physical disabilities as well. And I remember thinking, oh, we're just going to go, sit under this tree with these folks. This is kind of a sad experience. And we were there, and there was one young woman. She was probably just maybe 2 or 3 years older than me. She was in a wheelchair. She could not see. She could not hear. She was profoundly intellectually disabled. And I just thought, oh, we're just parking this girl under this tree. So we get out there in the park, and this staff person turns on some music. And he starts to go around from person to person, and depending upon their ability, he would dance with them or move with them. And he got to this girl, and I thought, well, there's nothing he's going to be able to do with her. She can't hear the music. And he wheeled her forward just a little bit till her face was in the sun. And he turned to me and he said, she really loves sunlight. And sure enough, as soon as the sun hit her face, she lifted her face to the sky, and this great big grin broke across it. And he's playing Bye Bye Miss American Pie, I can remember it, and he's tapping her on the shoulder in time to the music, and she's getting it. She's getting that we're having this lovely time there outside, and she's moving joyfully. And I think, oh, he's communicating with her. And she's communicating with us. The joy she was feeling was coming through. It was real. It didn't matter that words weren't involved. It was more about presence. It was more about action. Communication was happening beyond words. But there's no doubt that words matter. Words can distort. Words can clarify. Words can show love. Words can be destructive. Words have power, there is no doubt. But that presence beyond words, that silence, that attention that we give something can say just as much as anything that comes out of our mouths. With the current administration, we hear a lot of words, a lot of poorly chosen words, but I think that's deliberate, because when you're not careful with what you say, you can always say later that it was a joke, or you didn't mean it, or that people weren't hearing you correctly. You can always backpedal. So maybe we don't need to listen too much to power that does that. Maybe what we really need to do is pay attention to what that power does in terms of presence. Does it hold people in a loving way? Actions certainly communicate more than words. We can look at who's lifted up and who is pressed down. And there's the truth, beyond all the distortions and untruths and misinformation. The truth is what we experience, what we witness. Just this weekend in Washington, D.C., I don't know There's so much to keep up with these days, but in Washington, D.C., there is a Christian nationalist gathering that is happening, that is being led or participated in by this administration. It's something horrible to see. And at the same time, this weekend in Selma, returning again to Selma, we have our own Unitarian Universalist Association president, Sophia Betancourt, who is there to try and make sure that voting rights are upheld, along with another large gathering of clergy and people of conscience who come from all over the country. Where we show up matters, communicates something beyond words. But I think the other thing to name this morning, the thing that I didn't name 10 years ago when I was 10 years younger and more idealistic, is that there's a lot of heartbreak that we're holding these days. I know one of the heartbreaks I've discovered in ministry is that idea that you can't always sit down at the table with people. Sometimes we're not ready for that. Sometimes they're not ready for that. Sometimes there's too much trauma or anxiety or pain in the middle of everything for people to be able to listen and hear and share. It just doesn't always happen that way. It's heartbreaking. There's an old quote, I think it was Forrest Church, that said, "You're not really a minister until your heart has been broken." And I think I became a minister a few years ago, after I was ordained. But what I think happens for all of us when our hearts get broken, when the realities of the world press on us in such a way that we feel changed, is we can harden, we can become fixed in our expectations, our beliefs. We can become bitter in the middle of all of that hardening. But the other option we have is to actually open up to the more truth about who we are, what we believe, what matters. Heartbreak can actually break us open into the truth of our being. It can help us to move beyond performance and move us out of assumptions. Teach us to say what matters, to know that disagreement doesn't have to equal disconnection. So I had an earlier confession about ministry for you, which was that we all have a sermon we regret. I have a second confession I'll just share with you this morning. I've been preaching the same sermon to you since I got here. Sure, the content changes superficially. It might have a different structure, different theme on the surface. But the reality is I'm trying to say one thing to you each and every week. I'm trying to say from the position I have in our Unitarian Universalist community, I love you. You're worthy of love. And when you feel loved, you are more empowered to go out into the world and help it to feel loved. It's the same darn sermon every week, folks. Secret's out. But the reality is that that is my truth. Underneath all the words, underneath the heartbreak, in the center of my being, that's what I want to convey to you. That's why I'm here. You know, a couple people have told me in the reception line, especially on Sundays where it wasn't a particularly sad service, they say, I don't know why I always cry when I'm here in the service. And I said, I think it's because you feel safe enough to do that. Because that is what we're trying to do as a community. Irene, your music director, and wonderful worship associates like Carol today, and our worship committee, and all the people, our AV folks, everybody who puts together this moment. And it's so many people, from our greeters and our welcome team, everybody who puts together this moment. We are trying to create a space where people feel that sense of being loved, of being safer than you might be out in the world. And frankly, I don't know too many places where that's their agenda these days. So many other agendas at play, but very few places, communities, are just trying to make sure that people feel loved. So here we are, acknowledging the heartbreak, acknowledging that perhaps many of us were carrying what we thought were certainties before that maybe have evaporated with what we've witnessed and experienced. But also with that is the knowledge that maybe something more real has allowed itself to creep out and through. Something more honest that comes from our core. Something that is grounded in that love. That invites us to listen beyond words. To hear that bird song and know that it is part of a communication that is reflective of the interdependence of all things. To feel the sunlight on our face and know that we are but a part of a much, much bigger narrative. To practice listening beyond words, and to know that words absolutely matter. I love you. Tell me more. I'm afraid. I'm hopeful. Words matter. But love is more known, even than my words, by how we are present for people. It is known by what we do for people beyond words, because maybe the deepest truths are always something we can't articulate fully. And maybe when we move beyond words, that is the place where listening really and truly begins.